Listen, imagine a highway just after midnight. The shoulder is slick with October humidity and the orange glow of distant taillights. This is Interstate 45, north of Huntsville, Texas. A trucker glances over his coffee, and there, on the gravel, is a body. It's November 1st, 1980. A girl. No one can say her name for 41 years. This is still unanswered. I'm Erin Delato. Today, we tell the story of Walker County Jane Doe, now finally known as Sherri Ann Jarvis, and we ask the questions that remain. How did a 14-year-old from Minnesota end up dead on the shoulder of I-45? And why haven't we found the person who did this? Marcus, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Erin. It's an honor. This case has haunted forensic people for decades. There are facts here that are painful, and there are gaps that are maddening.
Let's start with the girl, Sherri. Marcus, can you help listeners picture her? Not just the crime scene, but the life that led up to that night.
Sure. Sherri Ann Jarvis was born March 9, 1966, in Minnesota. She went by the nickname Toddy to people who loved her. By the time she was 13, she was in state custody, removed from her home because of habitual truancy. That's a detail that matters a lot. It tells you she was system-involved, vulnerable, and by 1980, she had run away. She wrote one letter from Denver in August, saying she was frustrated but intended, eventually, to come home. And then she wasn't heard from again.
14 years old. 14. People hear that, and sometimes they're like, but why would a kid travel so far? We know there are a lot of reasons. Searching for autonomy, running from adults, following promises. The record suggests she was in Minnesota, then Denver in August, and somehow by late October, she was in Huntsville, Texas. It's a long distance for a child alone.
Right. And in the late 70s, early 80s, hitchhiking and riding freight, or being moved around by other people, was more common. You can get the sense she was trying to escape, maybe looking for someone, maybe looking for a place to sleep. Witnesses later said she told people she didn't have a place to stay, and, this is chilling, that she wanted to visit a friend at the Ellis unit, the prison near Huntsville. Was that true? We still don't know.
We'll come back to Ellis in a bit, but first I want to set the scene of discovery, because that day has been replayed in countless retellings. November 1, 1980, a truck driver finds a nude body on the shoulder of I-45. Marcus, what did first responders see?
They found a young white female, face down, naked, except for a pair of red, high-heeled leather sandals with straps. There was also a thin gold chain with a smoky stone pendant, an item later recorded by investigators, but unfortunately lost. Her body showed severe trauma, extensive bruising, swelling to the lips and the right eyelid, and a deep human bite mark on her right shoulder or back. The cause of death was asphyxia from ligature strangulation, likely pantyhose or similar material. Autopsy records also show vaginal and anal assault with a large blunt object, and, this is important, pieces of pantyhose and underwear were discovered inside her vaginal cavity. Investigators thought someone had stuffed them there to reduce bleeding during transport. It wasn't just violence, it was overkill and deliberate staging to hide evidence.
That detail about stuffing garments, it's grotesque. It indicates the killer wanted to move the body without leaving a trail. It indicates foresight. It indicates a disturbing level of control.
Exactly. The combination of severe beating, sexual assault with an object, The bite mark and the ligature suggest someone with rage or sexual sadism, but it also suggests the offender had some operational awareness. They attempted to move the body and minimize blood or telltale signs in a vehicle. That duality, emotionally charged violence and practical staging, gives us a complicated offender profile.
Listeners should hear, too, that early forensic estimates of her age were off. Initially, she was thought to be 16 to 20. It took a later re-examination to narrow it down, and ultimately, after identification, we know she was 14. That's a substantial difference in how you consider motive, culpability, and the suitability of suspects.
Yeah, then 1999 exhumation helped. They removed remains to get better forensic info and to preserve DNA. Age reassessment placed her most likely between 14.5 and 16.5, which fit closer to the reality once family DNA surfaced in 2021. It's a reminder that early forensic impressions can lead investigations down slightly wrong tracks, especially in the pre-DNA era.
I want to pause here and acknowledge how the community responded. Even unnamed, she was buried with dignity on January 16, 1981, in Oakwood Cemetery. The headstone said simply, "Unknown white female. Died November 1, 1980. People tended her grave for decades. The idea of strangers mourning a child whose name they didn't know, it's been a recurring, quiet force in this case.
That community connection matters. There was an early outpouring of care, funeral, burial, open casket. Later, online advocates and amateur sleuths kept the case alive. The reconstructions by forensic artists, we'll mention Carl Koppelman, gave a face to the nameless girl. That constant attention matters when DNA technology and genealogical tools later made identification possible.
Let's go back to the night in Huntsville, the truck stop sightings. This is one of those moments where you think, if one person had asked one question differently, maybe things change. Witnesses say she entered a truck stop late on Halloween evening, asked where the Ellis unit was, said she was going to see a friend there, and that she didn't have a place to stay. The Ellis unit reference is strange, and it's one of the case's most haunting puzzles. Marcus, what does that tell us?
It tells me several things. None definitive, but all important to consider. One, she may have actually intended to visit someone at Ellis. That someone could be an older boyfriend, an acquaintance, or an inmate she'd been writing to. Two, the friend at Ellis story could have been fed to her by someone transporting her as a cover. Tell people you're going to the prison so the person with her looks like a caretaker. Three, it could be a misremembered detail from frightened witnesses or an inaccurate report. Investigators have checked inmate records from that period, and as far as the public record shows, no confirmed link has been established. But the claim stands in the timeline, and it pushes a key question. How did she get to Huntsville?
Right. Did she hitchhike? Did she ride with a trucker? Was she accompanied by someone, possibly older, who promised to help her visit this friend? The answer changes who investigators will look at. Long-haul truck drivers, local residents near I-45, or people connected to the prison.
And here's another layer. The I-45 corridor had a pattern, unfortunate, horrific, of young women disappearing or being dumped near highways. People talk about killing fields along stretches of I-45 further south. Whether this murder ties to any serial offender remains unproven. Henry Lee Lucas, for instance, was investigated because his confessions and pattern made him a person of interest in many cold cases. But dental comparison ruled him out in this case. The bite mark didn't match Lucas's dental records. People online can be quick to name him, but official forensic comparisons excluded him. That's a useful correction to make.
Absolutely. And we should be careful with those online narratives. Let's talk about the early investigative era, 1980 into the 1990s. Walk us through what the authorities did, what they could do, and where the case drifted into cold case status.
Initially, Walker County Sheriff's Office led the investigation, with occasional help from the Texas Rangers. They checked missing persons reports across states, distributed dental charts, and did what was standard at the time: ballistics, interviews, scene reconstruction. But technology was limited. There was no central DNA database that could support broad matches. Over the years, the case had periodic attention, but little to change the status quo. In 1999, the remains were exhumed to get a DNA sample, an important step. They preserved DNA, but forensic genetic genealogy as we know it did not exist then. So the case stayed cold until renewed interest and new labs came into the picture decades later.
And that technological leap, particularly forensic genetic genealogy, changed so many cold cases. Othram became involved in Sherri's case in 2020, correct?
Yes. Othram, a private forensic genetics company based in Texas, specializes in extracting usable DNA from degraded remains. The Walker County Sheriff's Office partnered with them. They tried bone, but early attempts failed. They turned to preserved tissue from the original autopsy and sequenced the genome, built a profile, and used genealogical databases to construct family trees from distant cousins. That led to living relatives in Minnesota. By March 2021, they had potential matches, and on November 9, 2021, Walker County announced the Jane Doe was Sherri Ann Jarvis. For many involved, it was a triumph. For the family, a bittersweet one.
I remember reading the family's statement. Grateful, yet grieving, they thanked investigators, Othram, and the strangers who maintained her grave. It was a closure of some sort, knowing her name after decades of candles and questions. But the name didn't equal an arrest. That old tension. Name returned. Perpetrator still free. What's your take on where the investigation went after 2021?
Knowing her identity unlocked leads. Investigators could trace her path, call people in Minnesota, pursue travel records, and look at who she might have been connected to through friends or correspondence. They also revisited the Ellis unit angle and looked for any inmate or staff she might have intended to visit. Law enforcement said the identification generated positive leads, but as of early 2026, there had been no public arrest. That's often the reality. Naming a victim produces leads, but it doesn't always immediately produce a suspect. The trail from a missing kid in 1980 to an arrest in 2026 is long, and evidence can be gone. But the identification changes the investigation from anonymous person to someone with a history, with contacts, with family. It's a fundamentally different case to investigate.
Some listeners are going to ask, if you have DNA, couldn't you just match it to a perpetrator? But the DNA in this case was used to identify her, not necessarily to find the killer. The physical DNA evidence from the body, was there anything preserved that could lead to a perpetrator? Semen? Skin under fingernails? I know public records say no semen was reported. Marcus?
You're right, there was no publicly reported semen match. The assault involved a large, blunt object and insertion of garments. If the killer used a non-biological instrument, and if the body was moved, chances for finding perpetrator DNA are reduced. There might be DNA on the panties, shoes, or on the ligature, But after 4 decades, degradation and potential contamination make such evidence unreliable without a preserved chain of custody. The tissues exhumed were sufficient for her identity, but not necessarily for a clear offender profile at the DNA level. That's one of the frustrating realities.
Yeah. And then there's the broader context, the systemic vulnerability of runaway teens. Sherri had been in state custody due to truancy. She runs away, she writes home from Denver, and 6 weeks later, she's dead. For listeners, what's the takeaway about system failures and how they connect to homicide risk?
Systemically, when teens are placed in state care for something like habitual truancy, it often reflects family instability, educational neglect, or socioeconomic strain. For many adolescents, that placement is traumatic, and running away becomes an act of agency. But running away increases exposure to predation. People who trade services for sex, exploiters, or violent individuals who see vulnerability as opportunity. The 1980s had fewer coordinated supports for runaway youth, less robust outreach, fewer hotlines, fewer social services with resources to intercept. In short, a child who runs is often invisible to protective systems, and that invisibility makes them targets.
Listeners who follow cold cases online will know there's a tension between celebration of a name being restored and the disappointment when a killer isn't brought to justice. We want both. But let's pivot to ethics for a minute, because Sherri's identification used forensic genetic genealogy. That method is powerful, but has raised privacy concerns. Marcus, walk us through the ethical landscape.
Forensic genetic genealogy, FGG, is controversial for a few reasons. First, how the technique works. You sequence DNA from remains, upload a profile to consumer-oriented databases that allow law enforcement access, often GED match or family tree DNA, and find distant relatives. Then build genealogical trees to identify a biological family. The pros are obvious. You give names back to the nameless and solve violent crimes. The cons, relatives who uploaded their DNA often did so for family history, not expecting law enforcement use. There's a privacy ripple effect for anyone related to those users, and there's a lack of universal regulation. Some platforms have clarified opt-in versus opt-out policies. The debate balances the public interest in solving violent crimes against individual privacy rights. In Sherri's case, many view the method as a clear moral good because a child was named. But it still forces us to ask, how much intrusion is acceptable in the pursuit of justice?
I want to press you on that a little. Marcus, if a distant cousin uploaded to a genealogy website, and that leads to a 14-year-old getting her name back, is the privacy concern outweighed by the benefit? That's an emotional question for families.
It's an emotional and philosophical question. Personally, when a violent crime is at stake, especially involving a child, the societal imperative to identify and, where possible, to hold perpetrators accountable is strong. Many families whose relatives have been identified support FGG. But it's also necessary to have safeguards, transparency about law enforcement use, clear consent options on databases, and legal frameworks governing when and how investigators can use these tools. In the absence of consistent rules, the technology works, but it works in an ethical gray zone. That's not a comfortable space, but it's the current reality.
Listeners, I want to introduce a moment of tension here because it's real. On one hand, Othram and genetic genealogy gave Sherri back her name. That is transformative. On the other hand, we have to wrestle with how those tools are used, who gets access, and whether consent is clear for families who didn't sign up for this. Marcus, do you worry about misuse?
I do. I worry about mission creep. Today, it's murder investigations. Tomorrow, it could be broad surveillance of families or something else. That's why policy matters. We need legal guardrails, judicial oversight, chain of custody transparency, and strong privacy protections for innocents. But in practice, many jurisdictions are still developing those rules while the technology advances quickly. It creates a lag where the law plays catch-up to science.
Let's pivot back to the investigation. After identification, investigators said they had new leads. What kinds of leads are we talking about? Where does an investigation go with a name in hand?
With a name, you can interview family and friends to trace her travel path after the August Denver letter, subpoena records of bus or train tickets if they exist, interview anyone she corresponded with, including potential pen pals or an inmate at Ellis, cross-check social service records, and pursue physical evidence that might have been overlooked. It also allows for public appeals. Maybe someone in Minnesota remembers a different story, or a long-haul trucker remembers picking up a girl that night. So you shift from generalized missing persons outreach to targeted, human-centered interviews and timelines. That said, leads are often circumstantial when decades have gone by.
Right. The passage of time erodes memories and records. But sometimes time also creates new possibilities. Someone who was afraid to speak in 1980 might be willing now. We should also talk about the bite mark. People often latch onto that. How reliable are bite mark comparisons? They were used to rule Henry Lee Lucas out. But what's your take on bite marks as evidence?
Bite mark analysis has a fraught history. In the past, it was treated with more confidence than warranted. Studies have since shown the science is less reliable than originally believed. Comparing a bite mark to a suspect's dental records can be suggestive, but it's not conclusive in isolation. In this case, investigators compared the bite mark to Henry Lee Lucas's dental work and did not find a match. That helped exclude Lucas, meaning there was not sufficient similarity. But it's not as ironclad as a DNA match would be. Modern forensics is much more cautious about how bite marks are weighed in court.
Listeners, we need to balance our desire for certainty with the reality that forensics evolves. Okay, let's step back to the human side. After identification, a new headstone was placed. It names Sherri Ann Jarvis, includes her nickname Toddy, and reads something like, "never alone and loved by many." That phrase resonates. Marcus, what does naming do for a case like this? For family? For community?
Naming restores dignity. That's the simplest answer. To be Jane Doe is to be defined by how you died. When family members can sit at a grave and say Sherri, that changes the relationship to memory. For investigators in the community, a name channels resources into active questions. For the public, it humanizes the victim. She's not an archetype. She's a person with a childhood, with a nickname, with a family who now has photographs and memories. Psychologically, naming helps families grieve. It transforms abstract mourning into intimate companionship.
I think about the mother who received that letter from Denver saying her daughter would come home eventually. Imagine carrying that for 41 years without knowing. There's a kind of cruelty to not knowing. So when the name comes back, it's relief and pain at the same time.
Absolutely. It's closure in one sense, confirmation of her fate, but it opens fresh wounds about the circumstances. Family wants answers about how this happened, and identification often reinvigorates that desire for justice.
We should spend some time unpacking the Ellis unit mystery. Many cling to that detail as the key. Was it likely she was trying to visit an inmate? Or is it more probable she was told to say that by someone who brought her? Thoughts?
Both scenarios are plausible. If she genuinely intended to visit someone at Ellis, it implies an ongoing contact, either a family member, a pen pal, or an older accomplice with connections. That would be a very 1980s style of young people finding contact. Letters to inmates, mentoring programs, and sometimes predatory relationships formed through correspondence. If she was told to say that, it could be a manipulation tactic, making her seem like she was heading toward prison for ostensibly legitimate reasons, thereby deflecting suspicion. Investigators have checked inmate lists and correspondence where possible, but no public link has been revealed. It's one of those persistent threads that keeps investigators awake.
I want to acknowledge our listeners who contribute tips online. You all have done valuable research, but we need to be careful. Naming people on forums without evidence can do harm. Marcus, as a forensic criminologist who consults cold case units, how do you recommend citizen sleuths channel their energy constructively?
Channel it into sharing verifiable clues, not speculation. If you have a concrete lead, such as a verified trucking route, a dated photo that places someone in the area, or a contact who recalls an encounter, pass it to law enforcement or the official case tip line. Don't name a private citizen as a suspect unless you have evidence you can document. And document your own sources, screenshots, dates, exact phrasing. That makes your information usable. Also, collaborate with established advocacy groups or cold case charities who can funnel tips responsibly.
Good guidance. Now, we promised to discuss the broader Jane Doe issue, folks who remain unidentified, nameless. Sherri's case illustrates both the problem and the power of new tools. What do you want listeners to take away about the Jane Doe phenomenon?
That these cases are about real lives interrupted. Every Jane Doe is someone's child, sibling, friend. Identification matters because it restores identity and allows for human stories to be told. The technological revolution, genetic genealogy, and improved sequencing means we can now solve cases that were unthinkable 30 years ago. But we must pair that capacity with ethics, community engagement, and relentless investigative work. A name is a starting point, not the finish line.
Listeners will also hear the practical reality. Identification often leads to more, but not necessarily to arrest. The killer can remain unknown. It's frustrating, and it can feel like the story doesn't end. How do communities carry both celebration and frustration? What do families do with this mix?
Families tend to oscillate between gratitude and renewed anger. Gratitude that a daughter is named, anger because the person responsible is still free. Communities that maintain the grave often take solace in having honored the unknown for decades. Advocacy groups use the identification to push for renewed investigation resources. It's a complicated grief closure in one sense, opening of investigation in another.
Before we close, Marcus, I want you to speak directly to investigators still working this case or similar cases. Practical advice. If you could give a short checklist to teams chasing cold case leads after an identification, what would it be?
1. Reconstruct the victim's last 6 months with interviews of family and known associates. Even minor details can matter. 2. Revisit physical evidence with modern techniques. Things we thought useless might now be viable for touch DNA or trace analysis. 3. Re-examine travel routes and transportation records, truck stops, bus lines, freight logs. 4. Re-interview witnesses with cognitive interview techniques. A detail forgotten might resurface. 5. Coordinate with corrections to examine inmate correspondence archives around that time if Ellis's involvement is plausible. And 6. Communicate transparently with family. Set realistic expectations, but keep them informed.
Practical and humane. Thank you. Okay, time to bring this home. Marcus, what's the final take you want listeners to carry about Sherri Ann Jarvis?
That she was a child with a name, a nickname, a family who loved her. For 41 years, she lay in an unmarked narrative of unknown. Now she is Sherri. That matters. But naming her does not erase the urgent question of who did this. We owe it to Sherri to keep asking, to keep searching, and to keep balancing the promise of technology with ethical safeguards. And we owe it to other vulnerable young people to learn from the systemic gaps that left her exposed.
And for our listeners, if you have information, anything at all, please get in touch with the Walker County Sheriff's Office tip line. We will link to official resources and the public materials about the case in the episode notes. I want to close by reading a short excerpt of what was said about her grave after the identification. Never alone and loved by many. Those words are small, but they do work. It's what a name can do. Marcus, thank you for your time and your care.
Thank you, Erin. Keep telling these stories.
If you found this episode meaningful, please consider supporting the show. Subscribe, rate, and share. We keep lists of cases like Sherri's that still need public eyes, and we share contact information for cold case units who take tips. Next week on Still Unanswered, we'll follow another interstate corridor case, this time in the Southeast, where forensic genealogy has opened new doors. Until then, I'm Erin Delgado. Sherri Ann Jarvis, named at last, still waiting for answers. Music swells, then fades out.